The patrol car pulled into the Sunoco station at 11:47 p.m. Headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights hunting for trouble. Officer Sean Mitchell stepped out, his hand already resting on his holster as he watched the black man in the green jacket filling up his pickup truck. Sean's mind was already made up before he even checked the man's movements, before he noticed the calm, controlled way the stranger handled himself, before he saw the small American flag decal on the truck's rear window. In Sean's world, late night plus black man plus isolated location equaled one thing: probable cause. What Sean didn't know was that Dylan Parker had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, had been trained to read threats from 1,000 yards away, and could disarm a man before Sean's finger could even find the trigger. Which state do you live in? Have you ever witnessed someone being judged before anyone knew who they really were? What would you do if this happened outside your workplace? The fluorescent lights above the gas pumps hummed with an electric tension that seemed to amplify every sound in the night air. Dylan Parker stood beside his weathered Ford F-150, the gas nozzle clicking steadily as fuel flowed into the tank. His military green jacket, faded from years of wear but still carrying the weight of honor, hung loose over his broad shoulders. The fabric told stories Sean Mitchell couldn't read, stories of brotherhood forged in desert heat, of missions completed under impossible odds, of a man who had learned to find calm in the center of chaos. Dylan's posture was relaxed but alert, the kind of stance that came from muscle memory built through years of training. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the area with practiced efficiency, not paranoid, just aware. The way a soldier learns to be when survival depends on seeing trouble before it sees you. He noticed the patrol car the moment it turned into the station, tracked its movement across the asphalt, and registered the officer's aggressive exit from the vehicle. But Dylan had faced down insurgents with AK-47s and improvised explosive devices. One small-town cop with an attitude wasn't going to rattle him. Sean Mitchell, however, was already constructing his narrative. At 38, he had spent 14 years on the force. 14 years of seeing what he wanted to see and justifying what he wanted to justify. His thick frame carried the weight of a man who had let power replace purpose, whose badge had become a shield for his prejudices rather than a symbol of protection. The way he walked across the gas station lot, heavy steps, chest puffed out, one hand never straying far from his weapon, broadcast his intentions to anyone who knew how to read body language. "Something I can help you with tonight?" Sean called out, his voice carrying the false authority of a man who had learned to command through intimidation rather than respect. Dylan looked up from the gas pump, his expression neutral. "Just filling up my tank, officer. Having a good night?" The politeness in Dylan's voice should have been disarming, should have been a signal that this was not a confrontation waiting to happen. But Sean heard something else entirely. He heard what his mind had been trained to hear, through years of racial profiling disguised as police work: defiance, smugness, a black man who didn't immediately cower in the presence of authority. "License and registration," Sean demanded, stepping closer. "And keep your hands where I can see them." Dylan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This was the moment he had dreaded since returning from his last deployment 18 months ago. The moment when his service to his country would mean nothing to a man who saw only the color of his skin. But his military training kicked in. De-escalation, situational awareness, protecting civilian life, even when civilians didn't deserve protection. "Officer, I'm just getting gas. I haven't done anything wrong." Dylan's voice remained calm, controlled. In Kandahar, he had talked armed militants down from rooftops. This should have been easier. Sean's hand moved closer to his service weapon. "I said license and registration." Now, the gas pump clicked off with a sharp metallic sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Dylan carefully replaced the nozzle, his movements deliberate and visible. He had seen this scenario play out too many times, both in training videos designed to keep soldiers alive during stateside encounters and in news footage that kept his mother awake at night, calling to make sure he was safe. "My wallet is in my back pocket," Dylan said, speaking clearly for whatever dashboard camera might be recording. "I'm going to reach for it slowly." "Don't move," Sean shouted, his weapon now partially drawn, hands on the vehicle. Dylan's military mind cataloged the situation with clinical precision. Officer approximately 6 feet 2 inches, 230 pounds, right-handed draw, weapon clearing holster, nearest cover 15 feet behind vehicle, 2 exit routes blocked by patrol car positioning. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was a gas station in suburban Virginia, and the man threatening him was supposed to be on the same side. Officer Mitchell, Dillon said, reading the name tag with the same calm he had once used to identify enemy positions for artillery strikes. I'm a United States Army veteran. Green Beret. 3 tours in Afghanistan. I'm not your enemy here. Sean's face twisted into something ugly. I don't care if you're the President of the United States. Hands on the vehicle, now. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Dillon had heard that tone before, had seen that expression. It was the look of a man who had already decided how this encounter would end, who had written the report in his head before the first word was spoken. In the mountains of Afghanistan, enemies at least had the courtesy to declare themselves. Here, hatred wore a badge and called itself justice. Dillon placed his hands on the side of his truck, feeling the cold metal against his palms. His Green Beret training whispered tactical options in his ear. 17 ways to disarm an opponent. 11 methods of creating distance. 9 techniques for controlling a weapon. But every option ended with him being labeled a cop killer, his mother burying her son instead of worrying about him. Sean approached from behind, his weapon now fully drawn. Spread your legs. Don't move a muscle. This was the part that made Dillon's stomach turn. The part where his service record, his Bronze Star, his 3 commendations for valor under fire would be reduced to nothing. Where 18 months of defending American interests in a foreign desert meant less than Sean Mitchell's preconceived notions about black men at gas stations after midnight. I'm going to search you for weapons, Sean announced, his voice loud enough to carry to the security cameras he hoped would back up whatever story he planned to tell. Any sudden movements and I will shoot. Dillon closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of his squad members who hadn't made it home from Helmand Province, thinking of the flag-draped coffins and the families who would never see their sons again, thinking of the oath he had taken to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. He had never imagined that the domestic enemy would be wearing a police uniform. Sean's hands were rough and invasive as he conducted the search, pressing harder than necessary, lingering longer than procedure required. It was a violation disguised as police work, humiliation packaged as public safety. Dillon had been searched by TSA agents, by military police, by customs officials in 3 different countries. None of them had made it feel like this, like an assault on his dignity, a systematic destruction of his humanity. What's this? Sean said, his fingers finding the military challenge coin in Dillon's front pocket. It was a simple piece of metal, inscribed with the Special Forces crest and the motto De Oppresso Liber, to liberate the oppressed. Dillon had carried it through 3 combat deployments, through firefights that lasted hours, and patrols that stretched across hostile territory. It was his reminder of who he was and what he stood for. Sean pulled out the coin and studied it under the harsh fluorescent light. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, maybe even recognition of what he was looking at. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the same cold contempt that had driven him across the parking lot. Probably stolen, Sean muttered, loud enough for Dillon to hear. Lot of these floating around. eBay special. The insult landed like a physical blow. Dillon had earned that coin through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Had carried it while calling in airstrikes that saved American lives, while conducting reconnaissance missions that prevented terrorist attacks, while training Afghan forces to defend their own country. To have it dismissed as fake merchandise by a man who had never served a day in uniform was almost more than he could bear. Officer, if you run my name through the system, you'll see my military record, Dillon said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Staff Sergeant Dillon Parker, 5th Special Forces Group, honorably discharged. That coin was presented to me by my commanding officer. Sean laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humor. Sure it was. And I'm General Patton reincarnated. He pocketed the coin with deliberate cruelty, then stepped back. His weapon remained drawn, pointed at Dillon's back. The safety was off. Dylan could hear it in the way Sean's breathing had changed, see it in the reflection of the gas pump's display screen. This was escalating beyond a routine stop, beyond harassment, beyond anything that could be explained away by procedure or protocol. "Turn around, slowly." Dylan complied, rotating until he faced Sean directly. The officer's eyes were cold, flat, empty of anything resembling compassion or professionalism. They were the eyes of a predator who had found his prey, of a man who had crossed a line he could never uncross. "You know what I think," Sean said, his weapon trained on Dylan's chest. "I think you're a drug dealer. I think you saw my patrol car and got nervous. I think you were reaching for a weapon when I told you to put your hands up." "That's not what happened," Dylan said quietly, "and you know it." "I know what I saw," Sean replied, "and what I saw was a dangerous criminal threatening an officer's life." The security camera, mounted on the light pole above them, captured everything. Dylan's calm compliance, Sean's aggressive escalation, the complete absence of any threat from the unarmed veteran. But Sean had already calculated the angles, already knew which parts of the story would survive and which would be edited out of the official narrative. Dylan's military training kicked in one final time. In combat, when facing overwhelming odds, the objective wasn't always victory. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was simply living long enough to tell the truth. "Officer Mitchell," Dylan said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led soldiers through life-and-death situations, "you're making a mistake. I'm not your enemy. I've served this country with honor, and I've never broken the law. If you pull that trigger, you'll be killing an American hero for the crime of being black at a gas station." For a split second, something human flickered in Sean's eyes, some recognition of the gravity of the moment, of the line he was approaching. But years of justified brutality, decades of getting away with the unthinkable, had calcified his soul beyond redemption. "Should have thought about that before you went for your gun," Sean said. "I never went for a gun," Dylan replied. "I don't have a gun." "That's not what my report's going to say." The shot echoed across the empty parking lot like thunder in a clear sky. Dylan's body jerked as the bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the side of his pickup truck. Pain exploded through his nervous system, white-hot and immediate, but his mind remained clear. Military training had taught him to function through pain, to think through trauma, to survive when survival seemed impossible. Sean fired again. This shot caught Dylan in the chest, just below his left shoulder blade. The impact drove him to his knees, blood spreading across the front of his green jacket like spilled paint. But something was wrong with Sean's positioning, wrong with his angle of attack. Dylan's years of tactical training kicked in automatically, and he realized with crystal clarity that Sean Mitchell was a better racist than he was a marksman. The third shot went wide, sparking off the concrete behind Dylan's truck. Sean was nervous now, adrenaline and hatred making his hands shake. He had committed himself to this course of action, had crossed the Rubicon of premeditated murder. But his incompetence as a shooter was giving Dylan a chance his training had never anticipated, the chance to survive his own execution. Dylan rolled behind his truck, using the vehicle for cover as Sean advanced. Blood loss was making him lightheaded, but his mind cataloged tactical options with machine-like precision. 20 feet to the convenience store entrance, clerk probably calling 911, backup units en route, estimated arrival time 8 minutes. Survival window narrowing rapidly. "Come out from behind there," Sean shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You're making this worse for yourself." Dylan almost laughed at the absurdity of it. How exactly did one make being murdered worse for oneself? But he didn't have the luxury of contemplating the philosophical implications of Sean's statement. He had approximately 90 seconds before blood loss would compromise his cognitive function. Maybe 3 minutes before shock set in completely. Using the truck's body for concealment, Dylan pulled his cell phone from his pocket. His fingers, slick with blood, struggled to activate the emergency recording function. But muscle memory from countless hours of equipment training in hostile environments guided his movements. If he was going to die tonight, there would be evidence. There would be truth. Sean's footsteps crunched across broken glass and spilled motor oil as he circled the truck. This is your last warning. Come out with your hands up. Dylan activated the phone's recording feature just as Sean's face appeared around the rear bumper of the truck. The officer's expression was wild, desperate, the look of a man who had committed himself to an irreversible course of action and was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. "Officer Mitchell," Dylan said, his voice weak but clear, "you shot an unarmed veteran 3 times. This is being recorded. You can stop this now." Sean's response was to raise his weapon again, but 18 months of civilian life hadn't dulled Dylan's combat reflexes. As Sean's finger tightened on the trigger, Dylan moved. Not the clumsy desperation of a wounded civilian, but the calculated efficiency of a Green Beret who had survived 47 firefights in Afghanistan. The tackle caught Sean completely off guard. One moment he was preparing to execute a wounded man. The next he was flat on his back with a bleeding veteran on top of him, fighting for control of his service weapon. The gun discharged harmlessly into the air as Dylan's hand clamped down on Sean's wrist with the grip strength of a man trained to climb mountainsides with full combat gear. For 30 seconds, they struggled in the parking lot of the Sunoco station. Sean's advantages were weight, position, and the absence of bullet wounds. Dylan's advantages were training, experience, and the desperate strength of a man fighting for his life. It should have been an even match. It wasn't. Dylan's left hand found the pressure point at the base of Sean's neck, while his right maintained control of the weapon. The technique was called a blood choke in close-quarters combat training, a method of rendering an opponent unconscious without causing permanent damage. Sean's eyes rolled back in his head as oxygen flow to his brain was interrupted, and his grip on the service weapon loosened. Dylan took the gun. For a moment that lasted an eternity. Dylan Parker, decorated Green Beret, defender of democracy, son of a middle school teacher from Richmond, pointed a police officer's weapon at the man who had just tried to murder him. The weight of the pistol in his hand felt familiar. He had carried weapons like this through 3 combat deployments, had used them to defend American interests and protect innocent lives. He had killed enemies of the United States with similar firearms. Sean Mitchell was unconscious, breathing but helpless. It would be so easy. Self-defense. Justified. The man had tried to murder him for the crime of existing while black in America. No jury would convict. No prosecutor would charge. It would be justice served hot and immediate. Dylan lowered the weapon. He pulled Sean's radio from his belt and keyed the microphone with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Dispatch, this is Staff Sergeant Dylan Parker. I'm at the Sunoco station on Route 47. Officer Sean Mitchell has been involved in a shooting incident. I need ambulances for both of us and supervisory personnel on scene immediately." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, confused and urgent. "Sir, are you saying Officer Mitchell has been shot?" "Negative," Dylan replied, looking down at the unconscious cop who had tried to kill him. "Officer Mitchell shot me 3 times. He's unconscious but breathing. I have secured his weapon and am requesting immediate medical attention and supervision." Sirens were already audible in the distance. The convenience store clerk had indeed called 911, and backup units were converging on the scene with the speed that came from an officer needs assistance call. Dylan knew he had perhaps 2 minutes before the parking lot filled with police officers who would see an armed black man standing over their unconscious colleague. He placed Sean's weapon on the hood of his truck, stepped away with his hands clearly visible, and waited for the cavalry to arrive. Blood continued to seep from his wounds, staining the asphalt beneath his feet, but he was alive. Against all odds, despite Sean Mitchell's best efforts, Dylan Parker was alive. The first patrol car arrived 90 seconds later, followed immediately by 2 more. Officers poured out of their vehicles with weapons drawn, tactical lights cutting through the darkness like miniature suns. Dylan stood perfectly still, hands raised, bleeding onto the pavement of a gas station, where he had done nothing more threatening than fill up his truck. On the ground, now one of the officers shouted. Dylan complied, lowering himself to his knees and then to his stomach with deliberate, visible movements. The asphalt was cold against his face, rough concrete grinding against the wounds in his chest and shoulder. This was the position he had been trained to put enemy combatants in, prone, controlled, helpless. He had never imagined he would be the one wearing handcuffs, while American police officers stood over him with weapons drawn. As the cuffs clicked into place around his wrists, Dylan closed his eyes and thought about the challenge coin Sean Mitchell had stolen from him. De oppresso libera, it read, to liberate the oppressed. Tonight, he wondered who was going to liberate him. The last thing Dylan saw before the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance was Sean Mitchell regaining consciousness, looking around in confusion as his fellow officers helped him to his feet. Sean's eyes found Dylan through the ambulance's rear window, and for just a moment their gazes locked. Sean smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew the system would protect him, who understood that his story would be the one that mattered, who had complete confidence that his version of events would become the official truth. It was the smile of a predator who had been momentarily inconvenienced, but was far from defeated. As the ambulance pulled away from the Sunoco station, Dylan Parker closed his eyes and began to plan his war. The first thing Dylan Parker noticed when consciousness returned wasn't the pain, though that came crashing over him like a tide of fire seconds later. It wasn't the sterile smell of disinfectant or the rhythmic beeping of monitors that surrounded his hospital bed. It was the weight of the handcuffs chaining his left wrist to the bed rail. Even wounded, even bleeding, even fighting for his life, in an ICU, Dylan Parker was still considered a threat by the system he had sworn to defend. The irony wasn't lost on him as he lay there, tubes running into his arms, bandages wrapped around his chest and shoulder, staring at the metal restraints that marked him as dangerous. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 47 confirmed firefights, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. None of it mattered to the officer posted outside his door. To them, he was just another black man who had assaulted a police officer. Dylan's throat felt like sandpaper as he tried to speak, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Nurse?" A young woman in blue scrubs appeared at his bedside within seconds. Her name tag read Jessica, and her eyes held a mixture of professional concern and something else, something that looked like guilt. "Mr. Parker, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Her voice was gentle, careful, the way people spoke to wounded animals or traumatized children. "Like I got shot 3 times. Dylan croaked, managing a weak smile. "How long have I been out?" 2 days. "You lost a lot of blood. The surgeons had to remove 1 bullet from your chest. It missed your lung by about an inch. The other one went clean through your shoulder. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. Dylan almost laughed at that. Lucky would have been Sean Mitchell choosing a different gas station. Lucky would have been getting home safely to the small apartment he rented near the VA hospital where he volunteered with other veterans dealing with PTSD. Lucky would have been living in a country where his military service meant something to the people sworn to protect and serve. "The handcuffs," Dylan said, rattling the chain against the bed rail. "I'm guessing those aren't standard medical equipment." Jessica's face tightened. "I'm sorry about that. It's not my decision. The police insisted. Something about you being a flight risk." A flight risk. Dylan was barely strong enough to lift his head, had tubes running into both arms, and was wearing a hospital gown that left him more exposed than a Taliban sniper's position. But somehow, he was still dangerous enough to require restraints. "What's the official story?" Dylan asked. "What are they saying happened?" Jessica glanced toward the door, where the outline of the guard was visible through the frosted glass. She leaned closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "The news is saying you attacked Officer Mitchell, that he was conducting a routine traffic stop. When you became aggressive and tried to take his weapon, they're calling him a hero for defending himself against an armed suspect." The words hit Dylan like a physical blow. Armed suspect. That's what 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 commendations for valor, and 18 months of trying to readjust to civilian life had been reduced to. Sean Mitchell's narrative had already taken root, already been planted in the fertile soil of a media ecosystem that rarely questioned police reports. "I was never armed," Dylan said, his voice stronger now, fueled by righteous anger. "I never touched his weapon until after he shot me. 3 times. "I know," Jessica said quietly. "We all know. The surgical team, we've seen gunshot wounds before. The angles, the trajectory, It doesn't match what they're saying on the news. Dylan studied her face, looking for the truth behind her words. You believe me? Mr. Parker, my brother served 2 tours in Iraq. Marines. He came home different, angry, struggling with things he couldn't talk about. But he never hurt anybody, never broke the law, never gave anyone a reason to fear him. Her voice caught slightly. If someone did to him what they did to you. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Dylan understood the weight of that incomplete thought, the fear that lived in the hearts of military families who watched their loved ones come home only to become targets in their own country. Is there a phone I can use? Dylan asked. I need to call my mother. She's probably seeing this on the news, thinking I'm already taken care of, Jessica said with a small smile. Your mother called the hospital. We told her you were stable, recovering, and that you asked about her first thing when you woke up. She's driving down from Richmond. Should be here this afternoon. Dylan closed his eyes, imagining his mother's face when she first saw the news reports. Margaret Parker was a retired middle school teacher who had raised Dylan and his sister as a single mother after their father died in a construction accident when Dylan was 12. She had worried every day during his deployments, had cried tears of relief when he came home safely from Afghanistan, and had probably thought the worst dangers in her son's life were behind him. She was about to learn how wrong she had been. There's something else, Jessica said, her voice dropping even lower. The hospital administrator wanted me to tell you. There have been reporters trying to get in to see you. The police are keeping them out for now, but they're persistent, and there have been some visitors. What kind of visitors? Military, officers in uniform. They wouldn't give names, but they've been here twice. They said they were checking on your condition. Jessica paused. The police weren't happy about it. Dylan felt something stir in his chest. Not pain this time, but hope. His brothers in arms hadn't forgotten him. Somewhere out there, people who understood the true meaning of honor and service were taking notice of what had happened at that gas station. The question was whether they would be willing to go to war with the civilian police system to protect one of their own. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Jessica straightened up, instantly professional again, as a man in a white coat entered the room. He was tall, maybe 50, with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from years of dealing with trauma. Mr. Parker, I'm Dr. Martinez, the surgeon who operated on you. How are you feeling? Like I got shot by a racist cop, Dylan replied bluntly. Dr. Martinez glanced at Jessica, then back at Dylan. His expression was carefully neutral, the look of a man who had learned to keep his opinions to himself, in a profession that required him to treat everyone equally, regardless of how they ended up on his operating table. From a purely medical standpoint, Dr. Martinez said, you're extremely fortunate. The bullet that entered your chest cavity missed your heart by approximately 2 inches, a little to the right, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Doctor, Dylan said, I need you to be straight with me. What do the wound patterns tell you about what happened? Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. Mr. Parker, I'm a trauma surgeon, not a forensics expert, but I've treated a lot of gunshot victims over the years. Police shootings, gang violence, domestic disputes, hunting accidents. You learn to read the story that wounds tell. And what story do mine tell? The entry wounds suggest you were shot from a distance of approximately 8 to 10 feet. The angles indicate the shooter was firing from a position slightly above you, consistent with someone standing while you were kneeling or lying down. The pattern suggests rapid fire rather than careful aim. Dylan absorbed this information, his military mind automatically translating medical terminology into tactical language. Sean Mitchell had shot him execution style, at close range, while Dylan was down. It was the kind of shooting that spoke to intent rather than self-defense, murder rather than justified use of force. Will you put that in your report? Dylan asked. Dr. Martinez hesitated. My report will contain the medical facts, the interpretation of those facts. That's for others to determine. It was a diplomatic non-answer, but Dylan understood the position the doctor was in. Speaking out against a police shooting required courage that not everyone possessed, especially when careers and livelihoods were at stake. Still, The medical facts would be there, preserved in official documentation, waiting for someone brave enough to connect the dots. "When can I get out of here?" Dylan asked. "Medically? Another week, maybe 10 days, if there are no complications. Legally?" Dr. Martinez glanced at the handcuffs. "That's not my area of expertise." After the doctor left, Dylan was alone with his thoughts and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. He stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes in the acoustic panels, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened to him. 2 days ago, he had been a regular citizen, going about his business. Now he was a criminal suspect, chained to a hospital bed, while his would-be killer was being hailed as a hero. The system had failed him completely. The police department that should have investigated Sean Mitchell's actions had instead rallied around their own. The media that should have questioned the official narrative had simply repeated it without verification. The justice system that should have protected his rights had instead treated him like a threat to be contained. But Dylan had one advantage that Sean Mitchell hadn't counted on. He was still alive. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Jessica poked her head around the door. "Mr. Parker? There's someone here to see you. Says he's your former commanding officer?" Dylan's heart rate spiked, setting off a brief alarm on the monitor. "Send him in." The man who entered the room was everything Dylan remembered, and more. Colonel James Mitchell, no relation to the cop who had shot him, just one of those cruel coincidences that seemed to define Dylan's life lately, still carried himself with the bearing of a career soldier. His dress uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, his eyes sharp with intelligence and determination. "Staff Sergeant Parker," the colonel said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Colonel Mitchell, sir," Dylan replied, attempting to sit up straighter despite the pain. "At ease, son. You've been through enough." The colonel pulled up a chair beside the bed, his eyes taking in the handcuffs, the bandages, the monitors. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Tell me what really happened." Dylan told him everything, from the moment Sean Mitchell stepped out of his patrol car to the smile on the officer's face as the ambulance pulled away. He spoke in the clear, precise language of military debriefing, sticking to facts, avoiding emotional interpretation. The colonel listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. "And you never drew a weapon?" the colonel asked when Dylan finished. "Sir, I was never armed. I don't carry a weapon off duty. Haven't since I got back from Afghanistan." "The challenge coin?" "Stolen, sir. Right out of my pocket during the search." Colonel Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold fury of a commanding officer who had just learned that one of his soldiers had been betrayed. "Staff Sergeant, I want you to understand something. This isn't over. What happened to you? It's not just an attack on Dylan Parker. It's an attack on every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform. You served your country with distinction, and your country failed you. Sir, I appreciate you coming, but nothing." The colonel's voice cut through Dylan's protest like a blade. "You think the army abandons its own? You think we're going to let some small-town cop destroy the reputation of a decorated Green Beret without consequences?" Dylan felt something he hadn't experienced since waking up in the hospital. Hope, real, tangible hope, that someone with power was willing to fight for him. "What are you saying, sir?" "I'm saying that Officer Sean Mitchell picked the wrong veteran to execute. I'm saying that he doesn't understand who he's declared war on." The colonel leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The United States Army takes care of its own, Parker, and we're very good at taking care of problems." Through the hospital window, Dylan could see the sun setting over a city that had branded him a criminal for the crime of surviving an attempted murder. But for the first time since waking up in handcuffs, he began to believe that justice might still be possible. Sean Mitchell had made a tactical error. He had left a Green Beret alive. Now it was time for Dylan Parker to show him what that mistake would cost. Detective Sarah Chen had seen enough police shootings to know when something didn't smell right. 22 years on the force, 12 as a detective, and she had developed an instinct for the difference between justified use of force and a cover-up dressed in official language. The Sean Mitchell case reeked of the latter. She stood in the fluorescent-lit evidence room of the county police station at 6:30 a.m., 2 hours before her shift officially started, staring at the case file that had been dumped on her desk the previous afternoon. The assignment had come with very specific instructions from Captain Rodriguez. Open and shut case, Chen. Officer involved shooting. Suspect in custody. Just cross the T's and dot the I's. But Sarah Chen had built her career on refusing to take shortcuts, especially when someone's life hung in the balance. And everything about this case felt like one massive shortcut. The official report, filed by Sean Mitchell himself, painted a picture of a routine traffic stop gone wrong. According to Sean's statement, he had observed Dylan Parker acting suspiciously at the gas station and approached to investigate. Parker had allegedly become aggressive and non-compliant, had reached for what appeared to be a weapon, and had physically assaulted the officer in an attempt to disarm him. Sean claimed he had fired in self-defense after Parker grabbed his weapon. Sarah had read similar reports hundreds of times. They all followed the same template, used the same buzzwords, painted the same picture of heroic officers defending themselves against dangerous criminals. But this one had gaps you could drive a truck through. For starters, the timeline made no sense. Sean claimed the entire incident lasted approximately 3 to 4 minutes from initial contact to shots fired. But the 911 call from the convenience store clerk had lasted 6 minutes and 37 seconds, and the caller had specifically mentioned hearing the officer shouting for several minutes before any shots were fired. Then there was the physical evidence, or rather the suspicious lack thereof. No weapon had been recovered from Parker. The report claimed he had been reaching for the officer's weapon, but the medical examination showed defensive wounds on Parker's hands, consistent with someone trying to protect themselves, not aggressive wounds consistent with someone trying to disarm a police officer. Most troubling of all was the security footage from the gas station. According to the case file, the surveillance system had malfunctioned during the incident, leaving only fragmentary video that was too poor quality to be useful for investigative purposes. Sarah had worked enough cases to know that surveillance systems didn't just malfunction at convenient moments. They were tampered with, or evidence was destroyed, or footage was selectively edited to support predetermined narratives. Someone had gone to considerable effort to ensure that the only version of events on record was Sean Mitchell's. She opened her laptop and pulled up Dylan Parker's military service record. The information painted a picture that was completely at odds with Sean's report. 3 tours in Afghanistan, multiple commendations for bravery under fire, leadership positions in one of the military's most elite units. This wasn't some street criminal with a history of violence. This was a decorated war hero who had risked his life defending American interests overseas. The disconnect was staggering. How did a Green Beret with no criminal record, no history of mental health issues, and a spotless military service record suddenly become an aggressive suspect who attacked a police officer at a gas station? It didn't make sense unless you considered the possibility that Sean Mitchell was lying. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Detective Chen, my name is Colonel James Mitchell, U.S. Army. I need to speak with you about the Dylan Parker case. It's urgent. She stared at the message for a long moment. In 22 years on the force, she had never had a military officer contact her directly about a case. The fact that someone with that much rank was involving himself suggested that this case had implications far beyond a simple officer-involved shooting. She typed back, Colonel, I can meet you at 0800 at Riverside Diner on Main Street. Come alone. The response came immediately. Understood. Thank you, Detective. Sarah spent the next hour reviewing every document in the case file, looking for inconsistencies, gaps, or outright fabrications. What she found was a masterclass in creative writing, disguised as police work. Sean's statement read like a template that had been filled in with just enough specific details to sound authentic, while avoiding anything that could be independently verified. The medical report from the emergency room was more revealing. Dr. Martinez had documented 3 gunshot wounds with trajectories that suggested Parker had been shot while down, not while standing and fighting. The doctor had also noted defensive wounds on the subject's hands consistent with attempting to protect vital organs from gunshot trauma. That was medical professional language for this man was trying not to die, not trying to hurt anyone. At 7:45 a.m., Sarah left the station and drove to the Riverside Diner, a local institution that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and breakfast food that could feed a small army. She chose a corner booth with clear sightlines to all entrances, old habits from years of meeting informants and witnesses who preferred privacy. Colonel Mitchell arrived precisely at 8 a.m., his punctuality as sharp as his pressed uniform. He was tall, distinguished, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the intelligent eyes of someone who had seen enough of the world to understand how it really worked. "Detective Chen," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. Colonel, what can I do for you?" He sat across from her, declining the waitress's offer of coffee with a polite nod. "I'll be direct, Detective. Staff Sergeant Dylan Parker is one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command. He served 3 tours in Afghanistan with distinction, saved American lives on multiple occasions, and came home with commendations for valor that most soldiers only dream of earning." "I've seen his service record," Sarah said. "Impressive. More than impressive. Essential. Dylan Parker is the kind of man who makes democracy possible. Someone willing to put his life on the line to defend principles he believes in." The colonel's voice carried a quiet intensity that suggested deep personal investment in the outcome of this conversation, which is why what happened to him is not just a criminal matter. It's an assault on everything the uniform represents. Sarah studied the colonel's face, looking for signs of agenda or manipulation. What she saw was genuine anger, barely held in check by military discipline. "What do you know about what happened that night?" she asked. "I know that Dylan Parker has never been arrested, never been charged with a crime, never given anyone reason to fear him. I know that he's trained in de-escalation techniques, that he understands the value of human life, and that he would never attack a police officer without provocation." The colonel paused. "I also know that Officer Sean Mitchell has a history." "What kind of history?" Colonel Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out a thin manila folder, the kind that should have disqualified him from wearing a badge years ago. Sarah opened the folder and found herself looking at a collection of documents that painted a very different picture of Sean Mitchell than the heroic narrative being pushed by the police department. Citizen complaints going back 8 years, all dismissed or marked unfounded. Internal affairs investigations that had been closed without action. Use of force reports that showed a pattern of escalation in situations that other officers had resolved peacefully. "Where did you get this?" Sarah asked. "Let's just say that the military has ways of obtaining information when one of our own is threatened," the colonel replied. "The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Sarah continued reading through the documents. There were complaints from black citizens claiming harassment, reports of excessive force during routine traffic stops, and at least 3 incidents where Sean had been accused of planting evidence. All of it had been swept under the rug by a department that seemed more interested in protecting its own than in ensuring justice. "This is a pattern," Sarah said, more to herself than to the colonel. "Yes, it is. And Dylan Parker was simply the latest victim in a long line of citizens who Sean Mitchell has terrorized under color of law." The colonel leaned forward. "The difference is that this time, Mitchell picked the wrong target." "Meaning?" "Meaning that Dylan Parker isn't just some civilian who can be railroaded by a corrupt system. He's a United States Army Green Beret, and the Army doesn't abandon its own." The colonel's voice carried the weight of institutional authority. "We have resources, Detective. We have influence, and we have a very long memory when it comes to people who hurt our soldiers." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She was beginning to understand that this case was about much more than one corrupt cop and one victim. This was about institutional power, about the collision between military honor and civilian law enforcement corruption, and she was sitting right in the middle of it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I want you to do your job," the colonel said simply. "Investigate this case honestly. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. Don't let political pressure or departmental loyalty prevent you from seeking the truth. And if the truth contradicts the official narrative, Then let the chips fall where they may. Dylan Parker served his country with honor. The least his country can do in return is ensure he receives justice. After the colonel left, Sarah sat in the diner for another 20 minutes, nursing a cup of coffee and thinking about the conversation. She had been a cop long enough to recognize a crossroads when she saw one. She could follow orders, file a report that rubber-stamped the official narrative, and continue her career without making waves. Or she could investigate this case the way it deserved to be investigated, knowing that it would probably end her advancement prospects and potentially make her enemies within the department. It wasn't really a choice at all. Sarah drove back to the station and immediately put in a request to interview Dylan Parker at the hospital. The request was denied within an hour, with a note from Captain Rodriguez explaining that the suspect is still receiving medical treatment and is not available for questioning. She tried a different approach, requesting access to the gas station surveillance system for independent technical analysis. That request was also denied, with a note explaining that the evidence was too sensitive for secondary examination. By lunchtime, Sarah had made 7 different requests for information or access related to the case. All 7 had been denied. Someone was working very hard to ensure that this investigation never happened. That afternoon, she decided to visit the scene of the shooting herself. The Sunoco station looked exactly like what it was. A small-town gas station that should never have been the site of an attempted execution. Sarah walked the lot, noting the positions of the pumps, the security cameras, and the angles of approach that Sean Mitchell would have used. The convenience store clerk, a college-aged kid named Marcus, was working the afternoon shift. Sarah showed him her badge and asked if he had been working the night of the shooting. "Yeah, I was here," Marcus said, his voice nervous. "But I already told the other cops everything I saw." "I'm sure you did, but I'd like to hear it again, if you don't mind." Marcus glanced around the store as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Look, detective, I don't want any trouble. I need this job." "You're not in trouble, Marcus. I just want to understand what happened." The young man was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The cop was the aggressor. The whole time. The black guy. He was just trying to get gas and go home. He was polite, calm, didn't do anything threatening. But the cop, it was like he wanted a fight." "Did you see the shooting?" "I called 911 as soon as I heard the first shot. But I could see through the window. The black guy was down, wounded, and the cop kept shooting. It wasn't self-defense. It was—" Marcus struggled for the word. "It was execution." Sarah felt her stomach clench. "Marcus, would you be willing to testify to what you saw?" The young man's face went pale. "Detective, 2 days after the shooting, I got a visit from some of Mitchell's friends. They explained to me how memory can be unreliable, how witness statements can be misinterpreted, how people sometimes see things that didn't really happen. They threatened you." "They didn't have to threaten me. I understood the message. Keep my mouth shut, or find a new job, maybe find a new town." Sarah thanked Marcus and left the gas station with a clear understanding of the scope of the cover-up she was dealing with. This wasn't just one corrupt cop. This was a systemic effort to protect Sean Mitchell at all costs, even if it meant intimidating witnesses and destroying evidence. Her phone rang as she was driving back to the station. The caller ID showed the number for the county hospital. "Detective Chen, this is Dr. Martinez. We spoke yesterday about the Parker case." "Yes, doctor. What can I do for you?" "I think you should know. There was an incident here earlier today. Someone tried to access Dylan Parker's medical records without authorization. Hospital security caught them in the computer system, but they got away before we could identify them." Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Doctor, was any information compromised?" "We don't think so. But detective, whoever it was, they had knowledge of our security protocols. This wasn't some random hacker. This was someone with inside access to hospital systems." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, trying to process the implications of what she had learned. Someone was working very hard to control the narrative around Dylan Parker's shooting. They were intimidating witnesses, denying investigative requests, and now attempting to access medical records. This was bigger than one corrupt cop. This was a conspiracy. Sarah made a decision that would change the course of her career and possibly her life. She pulled out her personal cell phone and dialed the number Colonel Mitchell had given her. "Colonel, it's Detective Chen. We need to talk. This case is not what it appears to be." "I'm listening, Detective." "It's not just Sean Mitchell. There's a whole network of people working to cover this up. Witnesses are being intimidated, evidence is being suppressed, and someone just tried to hack Dylan Parker's medical records." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Colonel Mitchell spoke again, his voice carried the cold authority of a man declaring war. "Detective, how would you feel about working with federal resources on this investigation?" "What kind of federal resources?" "The kind that don't take orders from corrupt local police departments. The kind that answer directly to Washington when a decorated veteran is targeted for execution by people who are supposed to protect and serve." Sarah closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She was about to cross a line that would make her enemies of everyone she had worked with for the past 2 decades. But Dylan Parker deserved justice, and justice wasn't going to come from within the system that had tried to kill him. "Colonel, I'm in. What do you need me to do?" "First, document everything you've found so far. Every denied request, every intimidated witness, every piece of evidence that's been suppressed. We're going to need a complete record of the cover-up. And then we're going to show Sean Mitchell and his friends what happens when they declare war on the United States Army." As Sarah drove home that evening, she thought about Dylan Parker lying in a hospital bed, handcuffed and branded a criminal for the crime of surviving his own execution. But for the first time since taking the case, she felt hopeful. The young veteran wasn't as alone as his enemies thought he was. Sean Mitchell had made a tactical error that would cost him everything. He had left too many witnesses alive. The secure conference room at Fort Bragg had hosted briefings on terrorist threats, international conflicts, and national security crises. But the gathering assembled at 0600 hours on a gray Thursday morning was unlike anything in the facility's history. 12 active duty officers, 3 retired generals, and 2 Pentagon liaisons had convened for a single purpose: to discuss the attempted murder of Staff Sergeant Dylan Parker. Colonel James Mitchell stood at the head of the polished oak table, a tactical display screen behind him showing a detailed timeline of the gas station incident. The room was silent, except for the quiet hum of secure communication equipment and the occasional rustle of classified documents. "Gentlemen," Colonel Mitchell began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we have a problem. 3 nights ago, one of our own, a decorated Green Beret with 3 combat deployments, was shot 3 times by a police officer who then fabricated evidence to justify attempted murder." The tension in the room was palpable. These were men who had dedicated their lives to defending America's principles, who had sworn oaths to protect the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The idea that one of their brothers had been targeted for execution by someone sworn to uphold the law was a direct assault on everything they represented. General Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking officer present, leaned forward in her chair. "James, walk us through the intelligence." Colonel Mitchell clicked a remote, and the screen displayed Dylan's military service record, alongside Sean Mitchell's personnel file. The contrast was stark: a war hero versus a corrupt cop with a history of abuse. Staff Sergeant Parker served with distinction in Afghanistan, participating in 47 combat operations, earning 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. No criminal record, no disciplinary actions, exemplary service from day one. The colonel's voice hardened. Officer Sean Mitchell, by contrast, has 8 years of citizen complaints, multiple use-of-force incidents, and a pattern of targeting minority citizens. Major Rodriguez, Dylan's former company commander, spoke up from across the table. "Sir, I served with Parker for 2 years. He's one of the finest soldiers I've ever known. The idea that he would attack a police officer without provocation is absurd." "The local police department is claiming otherwise," Colonel Mitchell replied. "They've painted Parker as an aggressive suspect who tried to disarm an officer. The media is running with their narrative." General Williams studied the documents in front of her. with the analytical mind of someone who had spent 30 years navigating military and political bureaucracy. What about the civilian investigation? Compromised, Colonel Mitchell said bluntly. Evidence has been suppressed, witnesses intimidated, surveillance footage conveniently malfunctioned. The detective assigned to the case, Sarah Chen, is honest, but she's being stonewalled at every turn. The room erupted in quiet murmurs of anger and disbelief. These were officers who had seen combat, who understood the fog of war and the split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. But this wasn't combat. This was an execution attempt followed by an institutional cover-up. "What are our options?" asked Colonel Thompson, the base legal officer. "Limited, through normal channels," Colonel Mitchell admitted. "This is technically a civilian law enforcement matter. We have no direct jurisdiction." General Williams smiled coldly. "James, we may not have jurisdiction, but we have resources, and we have influence. The question is how far we're willing to go to protect one of our own." "How far should we go, ma'am?" Major Rodriguez asked. "As far as necessary," General Williams replied without hesitation. Staff Sergeant Parker served his country with honor. His country owes him justice. Colonel Mitchell clicked the remote again, displaying a new set of documents. "I've already initiated preliminary actions. Military intelligence has compiled a complete dossier on Officer Mitchell and his associates. We've identified patterns of corruption extending throughout the local police department." And General Williams prompted. "And we've discovered that this isn't an isolated incident. Mitchell and his network have been systematically targeting minority citizens for years. Parker was just the first one with the training to survive." The implications hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. They weren't just dealing with one corrupt cop. They were looking at a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity under the protection of badges and official authority. "I want a full operational assessment," General Williams ordered. "Resources, capabilities, political considerations, and I want options. Military justice may not apply here, but American justice damn well should." Meanwhile, 200 miles south, Dylan Parker was receiving visitors that the hospital staff hadn't expected. The 3 men who walked through the ICU doors at 1400 hours weren't wearing uniforms, but their bearing marked them as unmistakably military. The police guard outside Dylan's room started to object, until one of the visitors showed identification that made the officer step aside immediately. "Staff Sergeant Parker," the lead visitor said as he entered the room. He was tall, lean, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years in hostile environments. "I'm Agent Davis, Military Criminal Investigative Service." Dylan struggled to sit up in his hospital bed, the handcuffs rattling against the bed rail. "MCIS, what's the military police doing here?" "Protecting American interests," Agent Davis replied simply. "And right now, those interests include ensuring that a decorated Green Beret receives the justice he's entitled to." The second agent, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward. "Agent Martinez, MCIS, we understand you've been having some difficulties with the local justice system." Dylan almost laughed at the understatement. "That's one way to put it. They've got me chained to a hospital bed for the crime of getting shot by a racist cop." "We're aware of the circumstances," Agent Davis said. "We're also aware that there have been attempts to intimidate witnesses, suppress evidence, and control the narrative surrounding your case." And Agent Martinez pulled out a digital recorder and placed it on the bedside table. "And we'd like you to tell us exactly what happened that night, in your own words, for the record." Dylan looked from one agent to the other, trying to understand the implications of their presence. "This is a civilian criminal matter. What jurisdiction does MCIS have?" "Staff Sergeant, when a decorated veteran is targeted for execution by corrupt law enforcement, it becomes a federal matter," Agent Davis explained. "Deprivation of rights under color of law, violation of civil rights, and in your case, attempted murder of a federal employee. You're still in the individual ready reserve." The technicality was thin, but Dylan understood what was really happening. The military was flexing its institutional muscle to protect one of its own. Someone with enough rank and influence had decided that Sean Mitchell's actions constituted an attack on the military itself. "Before we begin," Agent Martinez said, "you should know that Colonel Mitchell has briefed us on your situation. The Army hasn't forgotten you, Staff Sergeant, and we don't abandon our own." Dillon felt something he hadn't experienced since waking up in handcuffs. Hope backed by institutional power. "What do you need to know?" For the next 2 hours, Dillon recounted every detail of the gas station incident. The agents listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. Their questions were precise, professional, designed to build an airtight case rather than simply gather information. "The challenge coin," Agent Davis said when Dillon finished. "You're certain Officer Mitchell took it?" "Absolutely. He pulled it out of my pocket during the search, made some comment about it being fake, then kept it." Agent Martinez made a note. "That coin is government property. Technically, taking it could constitute theft of federal property." "You're building a federal case," Dillon realized. "We're building multiple federal cases," Agent Davis corrected. "Officer Mitchell's actions appear to violate several federal statutes: civil rights violations, deprivation of rights under color of law, and potentially hate crime legislation." After the agents left, Dillon was alone with his thoughts, and a growing sense that the balance of power was beginning to shift. Sean Mitchell might have the local police department protecting him, but Dillon had something more powerful: the institutional might of the United States military. That evening, Detective Sarah Chen received a phone call that changed everything. "Detective Chen, this is Agent Davis, Military Criminal Investigative Service. I understand you're the primary investigator on the Dillon Parker case." Sarah pulled her car over to take the call. "Agent Davis, I wasn't aware the military was involved in this investigation." "As of yesterday, we are. Staff Sergeant Parker is still technically a member of the Individual Ready Reserve, which gives us federal jurisdiction. We'd like to coordinate our investigations." Sarah felt a surge of relief. Finally, someone with the resources and authority to cut through the local department's stonewalling. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you've gathered so far: evidence, witness statements, documentation of the cover-up. We're building a federal case, and your work will be crucial." "Agent Davis, you should know, my own department is working against this investigation. They've denied every request I've made, suppressed evidence, and I suspect they're monitoring my communications." "We assumed as much. From now on, you'll report directly to us. Your department will be informed that this case has been elevated to federal jurisdiction." "What about Captain Rodriguez? He's not going to like losing control of the investigation." Agent Davis's voice carried a hint of steel. "Detective, Captain Rodriguez's preferences are no longer relevant. This is a federal matter now." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her car for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The military had essentially declared war on the local police department's corruption. Sean Mitchell and his allies were about to discover that they had picked a fight with people who had resources they couldn't imagine. The next morning, Captain Rodriguez called Sarah into his office. His face was flushed with anger, and a federal document sat on his desk like an unexploded bomb. "Chen, what the hell did you do?" Sarah glanced at the document. Official notification that the Dillon Parker case had been transferred to federal jurisdiction under MCIS authority. "I did my job, Captain. I investigated a police shooting. You went behind my back to the feds. I followed evidence wherever it led. That evidence suggested federal crimes were committed." Captain Rodriguez's voice rose to barely controlled shouting. "That evidence suggested nothing of the kind. This was a clean shooting. Mitchell defended himself against an armed suspect." "Parker was never armed, Captain. You know it, I know it, and the federal agents know it. You're off the case, Chen. Effective immediately." Sarah smiled calmly. "Actually, Captain, I'm not. I've been reassigned to work directly with MCIS as a federal liaison. My new supervisor is Agent Davis." The captain's face went pale as the implications sank in. The federal government had just inserted itself into his department's operations, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. This isn't over, Chen. No, Captain, it's not. But it's about to be over for Sean Mitchell. That afternoon, Sean Mitchell was served with federal subpoenas requiring his testimony before a federal grand jury. The documents were delivered by U.S. Marshals, who made it clear that this wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the full authority of the federal government. Sean's lawyer, David Hartman, read through the subpoenas with growing alarm. "Sean, this is serious. They're not just investigating the shooting. They're looking at civil rights violations, federal theft charges, conspiracy. This could be 20 years to life." "It was a clean shooting," Sean insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "The suspect attacked me. I defended myself." "That's not what the medical evidence shows, and it's not what the witnesses are saying." "What witnesses?" "The gas station clerk isn't talking." Hartman looked up from the documents with grim expression. "Sean, they've got military investigators involved now. These aren't local cops who owe you favors. These are federal agents with unlimited resources and no loyalty to anyone in this department." Sean felt the first real stirrings of fear. Local investigations he could handle, local prosecutors he could influence. But federal agents were a different category entirely. Professionals who answered to Washington rather than local politics. "What do I do?" "You tell me the truth, all of it, because if there's anything you haven't told me, anything that contradicts your official statement, they're going to find it." That night, Sean Mitchell sat in his darkened living room, staring at the federal subpoenas spread across his coffee table. For 8 years, he had operated with impunity, protected by a system that valued loyalty over justice. He had convinced himself that his badge made him untouchable, that his fellow officers would always have his back. But Dylan Parker had changed everything. The young veteran hadn't just survived Sean's execution attempt. He had connections that reached all the way to the Pentagon, and now those connections were bearing down on Sean with the full weight of federal authority. For the first time in his career, Sean Mitchell began to understand what his victims had felt like: helpless, abandoned, and facing a system designed to destroy them. The hunter had become the hunted. Sean Mitchell had spent 8 years learning how to manipulate evidence, intimidate witnesses, and control narratives. Now, with federal agents breathing down his neck and his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, he was about to deploy every dirty trick he had ever learned in a desperate attempt to destroy Dylan Parker's credibility. The meeting took place in the back room of Murphy's Bar, a cop hangout where off-duty officers gathered to drink away the stress of their shifts and share stories they would never put in official reports. Sean sat across from Detective Mike Kowalski and Officer Tom Bradley, 2 men who owed their careers to Sean's protection and mentorship in the fine art of police corruption. "We've got a problem," Sean said, his voice low and urgent. The federal subpoenas sat on the table between them like toxic waste. The feds are building a case, and they've got resources we can't match through normal channels. Kowalski, a 20-year veteran with a gut that spoke to too many years of desk duty and beer, leaned forward. "What kind of resources?" "Military intelligence, Pentagon connections. They're treating this like a national security matter. Because Parker served in Afghanistan." Sean's jaw tightened. "We need to get ahead of this before they paint me as some kind of monster." Bradley, younger and hungrier than his companions, saw opportunity in crisis. "What are you thinking?" Sean pulled out a manila folder and spread its contents across the scarred wooden table. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be evidence bags containing various items. Parker's military service makes him a sympathetic figure. War hero wronged by corrupt cops. It's a story the media loves. Sean's eyes were cold, calculating. But what if Dylan Parker wasn't the clean-cut veteran everyone thinks he is? The other 2 men studied the materials Sean had laid out. There were photos that appeared to show drug paraphernalia, documents suggesting financial irregularities, and what looked like a psychiatric evaluation suggesting PTSD-related violence. "Where did you get this?" Kowalski asked. "Let's just say I have friends who understand the importance of controlling narratives." Sean's smile was predatory. "The question is, Are you willing to help me ensure this evidence gets into the right hands? Bradley picked up one of the photographs, studying it carefully. This looks like Parker's apartment. Good eye. Turns out our war hero has been struggling with some personal demons since coming home from Afghanistan. Drug use, violent outbursts, paranoid behavior, classic PTSD case that went untreated. Kowalski frowned. Sean, this is manufactured. If the feds figure out we planted evidence, the feds won't figure out anything if we do this right. These items will be discovered during a legitimate search of Parker's residence. Drugs, weapons, extremist literature, all the elements needed to paint him as an unstable veteran who attacked a police officer during a psychotic episode. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Sean had spent years learning how to plant evidence in ways that would survive legal scrutiny. He knew which judges would sign search warrants on minimal probable cause, which prosecutors would look the other way when evidence appeared convenient, and which media outlets would run stories without asking too many questions. What about the military investigators? Bradley asked. They're not going to be fooled by planted evidence. The military investigators are human beings with careers to protect, just like everyone else, Sean replied. When faced with overwhelming evidence that their war hero is actually a drug-addled psychotic, they'll cut their losses and move on to cases that don't embarrass the Pentagon. What Sean didn't know was that his conversation was being monitored by technology so sophisticated that the participants never suspected its presence. Military intelligence had identified Sean's network weeks earlier and had been tracking their communications through methods that would remain classified for decades to come. 40 miles away, in a secure facility at Fort Bragg, Agent Davis and his team listened to every word of Sean's conspiracy through equipment that could isolate individual voices in a crowded room from satellite feeds. The conversation was being recorded, analyzed, and prepared for presentation to federal prosecutors who specialized in police corruption cases. "Gentlemen," Agent Davis said to his team, "Officer Mitchell just handed us a confession to conspiracy to commit evidence tampering, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice." Agent Martinez looked up from her computer screen, where she was tracking the digital fingerprints of the fabricated evidence Sean had displayed. "The documents are sophisticated fakes, but they're not perfect. Our forensics team can prove they were created within the last 72 hours. And the photographs? Taken in Parker's apartment? But notice the angles. Someone had unauthorized access to the residence and photographed items that were later digitally manipulated to appear suspicious." Agent Martinez highlighted specific details on her screen. The metadata shows editing software was used to enhance shadows, suggesting the presence of items that weren't actually there. Agent Davis smiled grimly. "So Officer Mitchell has just committed multiple federal felonies while planning to commit additional federal felonies. How very thoughtful of him to document everything for us." The next morning, Dylan Parker received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. Captain Rodriguez, his former military lawyer, arrived with news that would have been devastating if Dylan hadn't been prepared for it. "Staff Sergeant, there's going to be a search of your apartment today. Local police have obtained a warrant based on what they claim is credible intelligence about drug activity and weapons violations." Dylan, now freed from the handcuffs thanks to federal intervention, sat up in his hospital bed. "Captain, my apartment is clean. I don't use drugs, and I don't keep weapons at home." "I believe you. But the search is going to happen, and there's a strong possibility that evidence will be discovered that portrays you in a negative light." Planted evidence. Almost certainly. Officer Mitchell is facing federal charges, and desperate people do desperate things. Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. "But here's what Mitchell doesn't know. We've been monitoring his activities. We know about his plan to plant evidence, and we've taken countermeasures." Dylan felt a surge of grim satisfaction. What kind of countermeasures? The kind that will turn his frame-up attempt into additional federal charges against him and his accomplices. The search of Dylan's apartment began at 10 a.m. with a convoy of police vehicles that attracted neighborhood attention and media coverage, exactly as Sean Mitchell had planned. Detective Kowalski led the search team, armed with a warrant that authorized them to look for drugs, weapons, and any evidence of mental instability. What Kowalski didn't know was that every moment of the search was being monitored by federal agents using surveillance equipment so advanced that it could detect the planting of evidence through electromagnetic signatures and infrared imaging. The search proceeded according to Sean's script. Items were discovered in locations where Dylan would logically have hidden them. Drug paraphernalia was found in a bedroom drawer. Ammunition was located in a closet. Documents suggesting extremist sympathies were uncovered in a desk. Each discovery was carefully documented by the search team, photographed from multiple angles, and logged as evidence that would support the narrative of Dylan Parker as an unstable veteran who had attacked a police officer. But federal agents were documenting something else entirely: the precise moment when evidence was planted, the specific officers involved in the conspiracy, and the chain of custody violations that would destroy the planted evidence in court, while providing proof of criminal activity by the planters. "Got him," Agent Martinez whispered into her radio as she watched Kowalski place a bag of white powder in Dylan's sock drawer. Clear visual on evidence planting, time-stamped and recorded. The search team emerged from Dylan's apartment 2 hours later with exactly the evidence Sean Mitchell had planned for them to find. Kowalski held a brief press conference on the building's front steps, announcing that the search had revealed a pattern of drug use and weapons violations that explained Dylan Parker's aggressive behavior toward police. This evidence paints a very different picture of the suspect than what his military record might suggest, Kowalski told the assembled reporters. "We're dealing with an individual who appears to have been struggling with serious personal issues that may have contributed to his violent behavior." The story ran on local news within hours, exactly as Sean had anticipated. Headlines proclaimed "war hero" or "drug user" and "PTSD behind police attack." The narrative was shifting, public opinion was being manipulated, and Dylan Parker's reputation was being systematically destroyed. Or so it appeared. What the public didn't see was the federal grand jury that convened an emergency session to review evidence of the frame-up attempt. What they didn't know was that military intelligence had documented every aspect of the conspiracy, from the initial planning meeting to the execution of the evidence planting. Agent Davis stood before a room full of federal prosecutors and presented a case that was so comprehensive, so well documented, and so damning that several of the attorneys struggled to maintain their professional composure. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have video evidence of police officers planting evidence in a federal crime victim's residence. We have audio recordings of them planning this criminal conspiracy, and we have forensic proof that the evidence was manufactured specifically to frame Staff Sergeant Dylan Parker." U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, a woman whose career had been built on prosecuting police corruption, studied the evidence with growing amazement. "Agent Davis, this is the most comprehensive documentation of police evidence tampering I've ever seen. How did you manage to monitor their activities so thoroughly?" "Ma'am, when the targets are corrupt police officers conspiring against a decorated veteran, we use every legal surveillance method at our disposal. The subjects made no attempt to conduct their conspiracy through secure channels, apparently believing that their badges provided them with immunity from federal oversight." The grand jury deliberated for less than 20 minutes before returning indictments against Sean Mitchell, Mike Kowalski, and Tom Bradley for conspiracy to violate civil rights, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The arrests happened simultaneously at 6 a.m. the following morning. Coordinated raids that ensured none of the conspirators could warn the others or destroy additional evidence. Federal agents, backed by U.S. Marshals, executed arrest warrants with the precision of a military operation. Sean Mitchell was taken into custody at his home as he prepared for what he thought would be another day of controlling the narrative around Dylan Parker's case. Instead, he found himself reading federal charges that carried potential sentences measured in decades rather than years. "Officer Mitchell," Agent Davis said as he placed Sean in handcuffs, "you have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise that right, because everything you've said for the past week has already been recorded and will be used against you in federal court." The look of shock and confusion on Sean's face was captured by news cameras that had been alerted to the arrests. Within hours, the story had shifted from troubled veteran attacks police to police officers arrested for framing war hero. Detective Sarah Chen, now working full-time with the Federal Task Force, watched the arrests from the command center that had been established to coordinate the investigation. For the first time since taking on the Dylan Parker case, she felt that justice might actually be possible. "Agent Davis," she said, "what happens now? Now we let the judicial system work the way it's supposed to work, detective, without corruption, without intimidation, without anyone putting their thumb on the scales of justice." Dylan Parker watched the news coverage from his hospital bed, no longer a suspect, but a victim whose case had exposed one of the most comprehensive police corruption conspiracies in federal law enforcement history. The challenge coin that Sean Mitchell had stolen from him had been recovered during the arrest, tagged as evidence in multiple federal felonies. Captain Rodriguez sat beside Dylan's bed, both men watching as the local police department that had tried to destroy Dylan's life was systematically dismantled by federal investigators. "Staff Sergeant, how do you feel?" Dylan considered the question carefully. 3 weeks ago, he had been a civilian veteran, trying to build a quiet life after military service. Now he was at the center of a federal case that would reshape how police corruption was investigated and prosecuted. "Vindicated," Dylan said finally, "and grateful. If I hadn't had brothers in arms willing to fight for me." "You did have them. You always will. That's what brotherhood means." Outside Dylan's hospital window, news vans lined the street as reporters tried to grasp the scope of the story they were covering. A decorated war veteran had been targeted for execution by corrupt police officers, had survived through military training and sheer determination, and had been vindicated by a federal investigation that read like a thriller novel. But Dylan Parker wasn't thinking about media coverage or public vindication. He was thinking about Sean Mitchell, sitting in a federal holding cell, finally facing consequences for years of racist brutality. The man who had tried to execute him for the crime of being black at a gas station was about to learn what justice looked like when it wasn't controlled by corrupt police departments. Sean Mitchell had made the mistake of his life when he decided to target a Green Beret. Now he was going to pay for that mistake with everything he had spent 8 years building. The hunter had not just become the hunted. He had walked directly into a trap set by people who understood warfare better than he could ever imagine. The federal holding cell in downtown Richmond was a far cry from the comfortable police station where Sean Mitchell had spent 8 years dispensing his own twisted version of justice. The concrete walls, steel bars, and constant surveillance were a harsh reminder that he was no longer the hunter, he was the prey. Sean sat on the narrow metal bench that served as both bed and chair, staring at the federal indictment that had been served to him 3 hours earlier. Conspiracy to violate civil rights, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, deprivation of rights under color of law. Each charge carried potential sentences that would keep him in federal prison until he was an old man, assuming he lived that long. His court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Robert Hayes, had been blunt about Sean's prospects. "Mr. Mitchell, the federal government has recordings of you planning to plant evidence. They have video of your associates actually planting that evidence. They have forensic proof that the evidence was manufactured, and they have testimony from the victim that contradicts every element of your official report." "It was a clean shooting," Sean insisted, but his voice lacked the conviction that had once intimidated suspects and witnesses. "Parker attacked me. I defended myself." Hayes looked at Sean with the expression of a man who had heard similar denials from hundreds of clients over the years. "Mr. Mitchell, denying reality isn't going to help you here. The evidence against you is overwhelming. Your only option is to cooperate with federal investigators and hope for a plea bargain that keeps you out of prison for the rest of your life." "Cooperate how?" "Tell them about the others, the network of officers who helped you cover up previous incidents, the supervisors who looked the other way, the prosecutors who declined to press charges. The federal government isn't just interested in your case. They want to dismantle the entire system of corruption that made your actions possible." Sean closed his eyes, understanding the magnitude of what Hayes was suggesting. Cooperating would mean betraying every police officer who had ever helped him, every supervisor who had protected him, every friend who had stayed silent about his activities. It would mean admitting that his entire career had been built on a foundation of racism, violence, and lies. But the alternative was spending the next 30 years in a federal penitentiary where former police officers had a life expectancy measured in months rather than decades. "I need time to think," Sean said. "You have 24 hours," Hayes replied. "After that, the federal prosecutors withdraw their plea offer and you face trial on all charges." Meanwhile, 200 miles away at Fort Bragg, Dylan Parker was experiencing his own form of reckoning. He had been medically cleared for discharge from the hospital and was now staying in VOQ, visiting officers' quarters, while federal investigators prepared for the trials that would determine whether justice was truly possible in his case. Colonel Mitchell had visited that morning with news that was both encouraging and troubling. "Staff Sergeant, the federal investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic police corruption extending far beyond your case. Officer Mitchell and his associates have been involved in dozens of incidents over the past 8 years. Dylan sat in the small but comfortable quarters, still wearing civilian clothes that felt strange after weeks in hospital gowns. "How many victims?" 17 that we've identified so far, mostly minority citizens who were targeted for harassment, assault, or evidence planting. Your case was simply the most recent and the most documented. The number hit Dylan like a physical blow. 17 people whose lives had been destroyed by Sean Mitchell's racism and the system that protected him. 17 families who had suffered injustice while the perpetrator continued to wear a badge and collect a paycheck. "Are they coming forward?" Dylan asked. "Some are. Others are afraid. They've been conditioned to believe that speaking out against police will only make their lives worse. But your case has given them hope that justice might actually be possible." Colonel Mitchell pulled out a tablet and showed Dylan a series of news clips from around the country. Veterans organizations were issuing statements of support. Civil rights groups were demanding investigations into similar cases in other jurisdictions. Congressional representatives were calling for hearings on police brutality against military veterans. "You've become a symbol, Staff Sergeant, a symbol of resistance against corruption, of the military's commitment to protecting its own, and of the possibility that the system can be forced to work the way it's supposed to work." Dylan watched the news coverage with mixed feelings. He had never asked to be a symbol or a spokesperson for police reform. He had simply wanted to buy gas and go home safely. But Sean Mitchell's attack had thrust him into a role he was still learning to understand. "What happens now?" Dylan asked. "Now you help us ensure that Sean Mitchell and his accomplices face justice. Your testimony will be crucial in the federal trials." "And after that?" Colonel Mitchell smiled. "After that, you decide what you want to do with the rest of your life. But I suspect it's going to involve helping other veterans who find themselves in similar situations." Back in Richmond, the federal investigation was expanding with each passing hour. Agent Davis had established a task force that included FBI investigators, military police, civil rights attorneys, and prosecutors specializing in police corruption. Their mandate was simple: identify every victim of Sean Mitchell's network and build cases that would ensure no one escaped justice. The breakthrough came when Detective Sarah Chen, now working full-time with the federal task force, received a phone call that changed everything. "Detective Chen, my name is Marcus Williams. I think I have information about Officer Sean Mitchell that you need to hear." Sarah put the call on speaker so Agent Davis could listen. "Mr. Williams, what kind of information?" 3 years ago, Officer Mitchell arrested my son for drug possession. Said he found cocaine in our car during a traffic stop. My boy was 17, honor student, never touched drugs in his life. But Mitchell claimed he saw my son throw something out the window when the police car approached. Sarah and Agent Davis exchanged glances. The pattern was becoming clear. "Mr. Williams, what happened to your son?" 2 years in juvenile detention. Lost his scholarship to Virginia Tech. Never recovered from the trauma. He's working at a grocery store now, too afraid to even apply for college because he thinks his record will follow him forever. Mr. Williams, would you be willing to testify about what really happened during that traffic stop? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Detective, I've been afraid to speak up for 3 years, but when I saw that veteran on the news, saw what Mitchell tried to do to him, I realized that staying silent just makes it worse. We'll protect you, Mr. Williams. This is a federal investigation now. Officer Mitchell can't hurt you or your family anymore. Within hours of Marcus Williams' call, the federal task force received 6 more calls from Mitchell's previous victims. Each story followed the same pattern: traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily, evidence that appeared from nowhere, charges that destroyed lives and families. Agent Martinez compiled the testimonies into a comprehensive report that painted a picture of systematic racist persecution that had operated under the protection of official authority for nearly a decade. Agent Davis, she said, presenting her findings to the task force, we're not dealing with a few bad cops. We're looking at an organized criminal enterprise that used police badges as cover for race-based terrorism. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Sean Mitchell hadn't been operating alone. He had been part of a network that included supervisors who covered up his actions, prosecutors who declined to investigate his cases, and fellow officers who provided false testimony to support his reports. How high does this go? Agent Davis asked. All the way to the top. Chief of Police William Carter has been aware of citizen complaints against Mitchell for 6 years. Instead of investigating, he promoted Mitchell and assigned him to patrol areas with high minority populations. Agent Davis felt his anger building as he read through the evidence. This wasn't just police brutality. It was a coordinated campaign of racial oppression that had been sanctioned and protected by the highest levels of law enforcement leadership. Agent Martinez, I want arrest warrants for everyone involved. Supervisors, prosecutors, fellow officers, anyone who helped Sean Mitchell terrorize innocent citizens.
Sir, that's going to be a lot of arrests.
Good. It's time for these people to understand that their badges don't make them immune from federal justice. The second wave of arrests began at dawn on a cold Friday morning. FBI agents, backed by U.S. Marshals, executed coordinated raids on the homes and offices of 12 current and former police officials. Chief Carter was arrested as he arrived at the police station, handcuffed in front of news cameras that had been alerted to cover what would become known as the largest police corruption investigation in Virginia history. The images of police officials being led away in handcuffs sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. For decades, police officers had operated under the assumption that their fellow officers would always protect them, that the blue wall of silence was impenetrable, and that civilian oversight was largely symbolic. Dylan Parker's case had shattered those assumptions. As news of the expanded arrests spread, more victims began coming forward. The federal task force established a hotline that received over 200 calls in the first 24 hours. Each call represented another life that had been damaged by the corruption that Sean Mitchell had embodied. Dylan watched the news coverage from Fort Bragg, struggling to process the magnitude of what his case had revealed. 17 confirmed victims had become 43, then 67, then more than 100. Each new testimony added another layer to the horror of what Sean Mitchell and his network had been doing to innocent citizens. Staff Sergeant Colonel Mitchell said during one of their regular briefings, "I want you to understand something. What happened to you was just the tip of the iceberg. Your military training allowed you to survive an encounter that might have killed someone else. Your military connections allowed you to fight back in ways that other victims couldn't. In a very real sense, you didn't just save your own life, you saved the lives of future victims." Dylan nodded, but the weight of being a symbol for justice was heavier than any equipment he had carried in Afghanistan. "Sir, I keep thinking about all the people who didn't have the army looking out for them. All the families that were destroyed while I was overseas fighting for freedom. That's exactly why your testimony is so important. Staff Sergeant, you're not just speaking for yourself. You're speaking for everyone who was silenced by fear, intimidation, or the belief that justice was impossible." In his federal holding cell, Sean Mitchell was learning what it felt like to be powerless. The guards treated him with professional courtesy, but none of the deference he had grown accustomed to as a police officer. The other inmates, learning of his background, had made it clear that his presence was unwelcome and potentially dangerous. His attorney had delivered news that was even worse than the criminal charges. The families of Mitchell's victims were filing civil lawsuits that would likely result in financial judgments large enough to destroy him economically, even if he somehow avoided prison time. "Sean," Hayes said during their latest meeting, "the federal prosecutors have sweetened their plea offer. Full cooperation in exchange for 15 years instead of life. But the offer expires at midnight tonight." Sean stared at the plea agreement, understanding that signing it would mean confessing to crimes that would brand him as a monster for the rest of his life. But refusing to sign it would mean facing trial with evidence so overwhelming that conviction was certain and sentencing would be measured in decades. "What about protective custody?" Sean asked. "If I testify against the others?" "Prison is prison, Sean. Protective custody just means solitary confinement for the rest of your sentence. 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a bathroom, with 1 hour for exercise in a concrete yard." Sean closed his eyes and thought about Dylan Parker, lying in a hospital bed with 3 bullet wounds while federal agents built a case that would destroy everyone Sean had ever worked with. The young veteran had survived Sean's execution attempt and had somehow mobilized resources that Sean hadn't known existed. "If I cooperate," Sean said quietly, "if I tell them everything, will it make any difference for the victims?" Hayes looked surprised by the question. In his 20 years as a defense attorney, he had rarely heard defendants express concern for the people they had hurt. "Sean, cooperation might help some of the wrongfully convicted get their convictions overturned. It might help families get compensation for what they've suffered, but it won't undo the damage that's been done." Sean nodded slowly. For the first time since his arrest, he was thinking about someone other than himself. He was thinking about Marcus Williams's son, whose life had been destroyed by a bag of cocaine that Sean had planted in their car. He was thinking about all the other young men and women whose futures had been stolen by his racism and lies. He signed the plea agreement. The confession Sean Mitchell provided to federal investigators was 847 pages long and detailed every corrupt act he had committed over 8 years as a police officer. It named names, described methods, and provided evidence that would allow prosecutors to dismantle the entire network of corruption that had protected him. Reading Sean's confession, Agent Davis felt a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. Satisfaction that justice was finally being served, and disgust at the scope of the crimes that had been committed under the authority of law enforcement badges. "Agent Martinez," he said, "this confession is going to generate indictments for the next 6 months. We're looking at the largest police corruption prosecution in federal history." What about Mitchell himself? 15 years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime of knowing that he destroyed dozens of innocent lives for no reason other than the color of their skin. Dylan Parker received news of Sean's confession while preparing for his own testimony before the federal grand jury. The man who had tried to execute him had finally admitted the truth, had finally acknowledged the systematic nature of his crimes. "How do you feel?" Colonel Mitchell asked. Dylan considered the question carefully, vindicated, but also sad. Sad that it took a federal investigation to get the truth. Sad that so many people suffered before someone was finally held accountable. "Staff Sergeant, your case didn't just get one corrupt cop off the streets. It exposed a system of corruption that was destroying lives across an entire region. That's not something to be sad about. That's something to be proud of." As Dylan prepared to testify, he thought about the challenge coin that Sean Mitchell had stolen from him during their encounter at the gas station. De oppresso liber, to liberate the oppressed. The motto had taken on new meaning over the past month. Dylan Parker had been oppressed by a corrupt system, but he had also been liberated by it. Liberated by the military brotherhood that had refused to abandon him, by federal investigators who had chosen justice over convenience, and by his own determination to fight back against injustice. Tomorrow he would tell his story to a federal grand jury. But tonight he would rest knowing that Sean Mitchell would never again have the power to terrorize innocent citizens. The hunter had been caged. The Russell Senate Office Building had hosted hearings on war crimes, terrorist attacks, and constitutional crises. But the packed hearing room on a gray Tuesday morning in March was witnessing something unprecedented: a congressional investigation into the systematic persecution of American military veterans by the very police officers sworn to protect them. Chairman Senator Patricia Coleman of the Senate Judiciary Committee called the hearing to order with a gravity that reflected the national attention focused on Dylan Parker's case. News cameras from every major network lined the back wall, while the gallery was filled with veterans advocates, civil rights attorneys, and family members of Sean Mitchell's victims. "The committee will come to order," Senator Coleman announced, her voice carrying across the hushed chamber. "We are here today to examine the case of Staff Sergeant Dylan Parker, a decorated Green Beret who was shot 3 times by a police officer and then subjected to a systematic campaign to frame him for crimes he did not commit." Dylan sat at the witness table in his dress uniform, the ribbons on his chest telling the story of his service in Afghanistan. To his right sat Colonel Mitchell, his former commanding officer, and to his left sat Agent Davis, the federal investigator who had helped expose the conspiracy against him. The contrast between Dylan's military bearing and the empty chairs where Sean Mitchell and his co-conspirators would have sat was stark and intentional. Senator Coleman continued her opening statement. "This hearing is not about one corrupt police officer. It is about a system of corruption that allowed racial persecution to operate under the color of law for nearly a decade. It is about what happens when those sworn to protect and serve instead choose to terrorize and oppress." The first witness was Colonel Mitchell, whose testimony provided the military perspective on what had happened to one of their own. "Senator Coleman, members of the committee," the colonel began, "Staff Sergeant Dylan Parker represents the finest traditions of American military service. He volunteered for 3 combat deployments, led soldiers under fire, and earned commendations for valor that speak to his character and dedication." Senator Williams, the ranking minority member, leaned forward. "Colonel, what was your reaction when you learned that Staff Sergeant Parker had been shot by a police officer?" "Senator, my initial reaction was disbelief. Dylan Parker is one of the most disciplined, professional soldiers I've ever commanded. The idea that he would attack a police officer was simply incompatible with everything I knew about his character." "And when you learned about the attempted cover-up?" Colonel Mitchell's jaw tightened visibly. "Senator, when I learned that Officer Mitchell had tried to frame Staff Sergeant Parker with planted evidence, I understood that we were dealing with more than police brutality. We were dealing with an attack on the military itself, an attempt to destroy the reputation of a decorated veteran to cover up an attempted murder." The committee heard testimony from Agent Davis about the federal investigation, from Dr. Martinez about the medical evidence that contradicted Sean's official report, and from Detective Sarah Chen about the systematic suppression of evidence by the local police department. But it was Dylan's testimony that held the room in absolute silence. "Senators," Dylan began, his voice steady and clear, "3 months ago, I was a civilian veteran trying to build a quiet life after military service. I had served my country in Afghanistan, had come home safely, and was working to help other veterans adjust to civilian life." Senator Coleman nodded encouragingly. "Staff Sergeant, tell us what happened on the night of December 15th. Dylan recounted the gas station encounter in precise detail, his military training evident in the clarity and organization of his testimony. He described Sean Mitchell's aggressive approach, the escalation of the situation, and the moment when he realized that the police officer intended to kill him. "Senator, in Afghanistan, we knew who the enemy was. They wore different uniforms, carried different weapons, and represented different ideologies. But at that gas station, I was attacked by someone who wore the same flag on his uniform that I had worn in combat." Senator Rodriguez, a veteran himself, asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. "Staff Sergeant, you had the training to disarm Officer Mitchell. You could have taken his weapon and used it against him. Why didn't you?" Dylan's answer would be replayed on news broadcasts for weeks to come. "Senator, I took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But I also took an oath to uphold the principles that make America worth defending. Taking Sean Mitchell's life, even in self-defense, wouldn't have made me safer. It would have made me like him. The hearing room was so quiet that the whir of television cameras seemed loud. Several senators appeared visibly moved by Dylan's response. Instead, Dylan continued, "I chose to trust in the system of justice that I had fought to protect overseas. I chose to believe that truth would eventually prevail over lies, that federal investigators would see through the cover-up, and that my military brothers would stand by me when I needed them most." Senator Coleman leaned forward. "Staff Sergeant, that trust was almost misplaced. If not for military intervention, you might have been convicted of crimes you didn't commit." "Yes, ma'am, and that's why this hearing is so important. How many other veterans have been targeted by corrupt police officers? How many other military families have suffered injustice because they didn't have the resources to fight back?" The question hung in the air as Senator Coleman called for a brief recess. During the break, news commentators struggled to find adequate words to describe the impact of Dylan's testimony. Even hardened journalists found themselves moved by the young veteran's dignity in the face of systematic persecution. When the hearing resumed, the committee heard from Marcus Williams, whose son had been framed by Sean Mitchell 3 years earlier. "Senators," Marcus said, his voice shaking with emotion, "my boy was 17 years old when Officer Mitchell destroyed his life with a bag of cocaine that was never there. Honor student, never been in trouble, dreams of being an engineer. Officer Mitchell took all of that away in one night." "Mr. Williams," Senator Coleman asked gently, "why didn't you speak out at the time?" "Senator, who was going to believe a black father over a white police officer? I knew the system was rigged, knew that fighting back would just make things worse for my family, so I stayed quiet and watched my son's future disappear." "What changed your mind?" Marcus looked across the hearing room at Dylan, still in his military uniform. "I saw that young man on the news, saw how the Army stood by him, saw how federal investigators were willing to fight for the truth, and I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting my family. It was protecting the people who had hurt us." The emotional impact of Marcus Williams' testimony was evident throughout the hearing room. Several committee members appeared visibly angry as they learned about the scope of Sean Mitchell's crimes and the system that had protected him. Senator Williams addressed the broader implications. "Mr. Williams, how many other families do you think suffered similar injustices?" "Senator, in my neighborhood alone, I can name 12 families who had encounters with Officer Mitchell. Traffic stops that turned into arrests, searches that found evidence that wasn't there, young men whose lives were destroyed for crimes they didn't commit." The hearing concluded with testimony from U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh about the federal prosecutions that had resulted from Dylan's case. "Senators, the investigation triggered by Staff Sergeant Parker's shooting has resulted in federal indictments against 17 current and former police officers, 3 supervisors, and 2 prosecutors. We have identified over 100 victims of this criminal conspiracy, and we expect that number to grow as more people find the courage to come forward." Senator Coleman asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Attorney Walsh, how was this allowed to continue for so long?" "Senator, corruption of this magnitude requires institutional protection. It requires supervisors who look the other way, prosecutors who decline to investigate, and a culture that values loyalty over justice. The Parker case succeeded in exposing this corruption only because federal investigators were able to bypass the local systems that had been compromised." As the hearing concluded, Senator Coleman delivered closing remarks that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. "Staff Sergeant Parker, your courage in the face of injustice has exposed a cancer that was eating away at the foundations of law enforcement in your community. Your military service prepared you to defend America against foreign enemies, but it was your character as a human being that allowed you to defeat domestic enemies who had corrupted the very institutions meant to protect our citizens." She turned to address the cameras directly. "To the American people watching this hearing, understand that what happened to Staff Sergeant Parker was not an isolated incident. It was the inevitable result of allowing corruption to fester unchecked in our law enforcement agencies. We cannot claim to support our troops overseas while allowing them to be persecuted by corrupt police at home. The hearing ended with sustained applause from the gallery, something rarely seen in congressional proceedings. Dillon stood and saluted the committee, a gesture that was captured by photographers and would become an iconic image of the struggle for police accountability. Outside the Russell Building, Dillon held a brief press conference surrounded by military advocates and civil rights leaders. Staff Sergeant Parker, a reporter, called out, "What message do you have for other veterans who might face similar situations?" Dillon thought about the question, choosing his words carefully. Fight back. Don't let anyone convince you that your service doesn't matter, that your sacrifice was meaningless, or that corruption is too powerful to defeat. You have brothers and sisters in arms who will stand with you. You have federal investigators who will pursue the truth. And you have a constitution that is worth defending, even when defending it is difficult. Another reporter asked, "What's next for you?" "I'm going to continue the fight for justice, not just for myself, but for all the victims of police corruption. I'm going to work with veterans organizations to ensure that no other military family has to endure what mine has endured." Colonel Mitchell stepped forward to add, "The United States Army is establishing a new program to provide legal assistance to veterans who face persecution by corrupt law enforcement. Staff Sergeant Parker will be leading that program." As the press conference concluded, Dillon walked down the steps of the Russell Building with Colonel Mitchell and Agent Davis. For the first time since that night at the gas station, he felt that justice was not just possible, but inevitable. Sean Mitchell, watching the hearing from his federal holding cell, understood that his world had completely collapsed. The congressional testimony had exposed not just his crimes, but the institutional corruption that had made them possible. There would be no going back, no return to the days when his badge protected him from consequences. His attorney had warned him that the congressional hearing would make a plea bargain more difficult. Public attention meant that prosecutors would be under pressure to seek maximum sentences rather than accepting deals that might be seen as lenient. "Sean," Hayes said during their meeting after the hearing, "the federal prosecutors have withdrawn their plea offer. They're going to trial on all charges." Sean stared at the wall of his cell, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost. His career, his freedom, his family, his future, all destroyed by his decision to execute a black veteran at a gas station. "What are my chances at trial?" Hayes was brutally honest. With Dillon Parker's congressional testimony being replayed on every news channel, with over 100 victims prepared to testify against you, with your own confession contradicting your original report, Sean, your chances are zero. That night, Dillon Parker stood on the balcony of his hotel room in Washington, looking out over the city that had finally heard his story. The lights of the Capitol dome shone in the distance, a reminder of the democratic principles he had sworn to defend. His phone buzzed with a text message from his mother. "Son, I watched every minute of the hearing today. I have never been more proud of who you are and what you stand for." Dillon smiled, thinking about the challenge coin that had been returned to him after Sean's arrest. "Do oppresso liber," to liberate the oppressed. The motto had taken on new meaning through his ordeal. He had been oppressed by a corrupt system, but he had also liberated himself through courage, determination, and the support of people who believed in justice. More importantly, his fight had liberated over 100 other victims who had been silenced by fear and intimidation. Sean Mitchell had tried to execute him for the crime of being black in America. Instead, Dillon Parker had helped expose and dismantle a criminal conspiracy that had terrorized innocent citizens for nearly a decade. The hunter had not just been defeated, he had been completely destroyed by the very man he had tried to kill. Justice, Dillon realized, was not just about punishment. It was about redemption, healing, and the possibility that good people could triumph over evil when they refused to surrender to corruption. Tomorrow, he would begin his new mission, ensuring that no other veteran would face what he had faced, and that no other family would suffer what so many families had suffered under Sean Mitchell's reign of terror. The war for justice was far from over. But tonight, Dillon Parker could rest knowing that he had won the most important battle of his life. 6 months after the congressional hearing that had captivated the nation, Dillon Parker stood in the same courtroom where Sean Mitchell would learn his fate. The federal courthouse in Richmond was packed with victims, family members, journalists, and veterans who had traveled from across the country to witness what many considered the most important police corruption sentencing in modern American history. Sean Mitchell sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to a chain around his waist. The transformation from confident predator to broken convict was complete. His hair had gone gray during his months in federal custody. His once imposing frame had withered under the stress of incarceration, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had finally understood the magnitude of his crimes. Judge Rebecca Harrison, a veteran federal jurist known for her fairness and her intolerance of corruption, reviewed the sentencing memorandum with the gravity the case deserved. The courtroom was silent except for the soft rustling of papers and the barely audible whir of news cameras. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Harrison began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "you have pleaded guilty to conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. These crimes were committed over a period of 8 years and affected more than 100 victims." Sean's attorney, Robert Hayes, had prepared him for this moment, but nothing could have lessened the impact of hearing his crimes enumerated in federal court before a national audience. "Before I impose sentence," Judge Harrison continued, "I want to address the nature of these crimes and their impact on our community, our justice system, and our democracy itself." Dillon sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing his dress uniform one final time for these proceedings. Beside him sat Marcus Williams, whose son's life had been destroyed by Sean's evidence planting 3 years earlier. Behind them were dozens of other victims and family members who had found the courage to speak out after Dillon's case had shown them that justice was possible. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Harrison said, looking directly at the defendant, "you took an oath to protect and serve the citizens of this community. Instead, you terrorized them. You used your badge as a weapon, your authority as a tool of oppression, and your position of trust to perpetrate crimes that strike at the very foundation of our constitutional system." The judge paused, allowing her words to resonate throughout the courtroom. "The evidence presented to this court shows that you targeted citizens based on their race, planted evidence to support false charges, intimidated witnesses to prevent them from speaking the truth, and attempted to murder Staff Sergeant Dylan Parker simply because he represented everything you despised about equality under law." Sean's shoulders shook slightly, but whether from fear, remorse, or simple physical exhaustion was impossible to determine. "Staff Sergeant Parker," Judge Harrison said, turning to address Dillon directly, "would you like to make a victim impact statement before I impose sentence?" Dillon stood slowly, his military bearing evident even in the emotional moment. He had prepared remarks, but as he looked at Sean Mitchell, the man who had tried to execute him for the crime of being black in America, he chose to speak from the heart instead. "Your Honor, 6 months ago, I was a civilian veteran trying to live a quiet life after military service. Sean Mitchell changed that forever when he decided that my life was worthless because of the color of my skin." Dillon's voice was steady, controlled, carrying the authority of someone who had faced down enemies in Afghanistan and corrupt police in Virginia. But Sean Mitchell made a mistake. He thought that wearing a badge made him powerful, that intimidation would silence his victims, and that the system would protect him no matter what crimes he committed. He was wrong. Dillon turned to look directly at Sean, who couldn't meet his eyes. "Your Honor, I don't feel sorry for Sean Mitchell. I feel sorry for all the victims who suffered before someone finally stopped him. I feel sorry for the families that were destroyed while he hid behind his badge. And I feel sorry for the good police officers whose reputations have been damaged by his crimes." The courtroom was absolutely silent as Dillon concluded his statement. "Sean Mitchell tried to kill me because he thought I was powerless, but he forgot that I had brothers and sisters in arms who would never abandon me. He forgot that federal investigators exist to pursue justice even when local systems are corrupted. And he forgot that the Constitution he swore to defend is stronger than the hatred he represented." Dillon sat down to muted applause from the gallery, his dignity in the face of attempted murder providing a stark contrast to Sean's crumbling composure. Judge Harrison spent the next 20 minutes detailing the factors that had influenced her sentencing decision. Sean's lack of remorse, the systematic nature of his crimes, the number of victims, and the damage to public trust in law enforcement all weighed heavily against him. Mr. Mitchell, the court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. You will serve your sentence in the federal correctional system, and you are permanently barred from employment in any law enforcement capacity. The sentence was harsher than even federal prosecutors had requested, reflecting Judge Harrison's determination to send a message that police corruption would face the full weight of federal justice. Sean Mitchell showed no visible reaction to the sentence. He had known for months that his life was effectively over, that he would die in federal prison as a disgraced ex-cop who had tried to murder a war hero. The only question had been whether his sentence would be measured in decades or life. 25 years was actually better than he had feared. As Sean was led away in shackles, Dylan felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that justice had been served, sadness for all the victims who had suffered before Sean was stopped, and determination to ensure that other veterans would never face what he had endured. Outside the courthouse, Dylan addressed a crowd of supporters, journalists, and veterans who had gathered to witness the conclusion of his case. "Justice has been served today," Dylan said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "But justice is not just about punishment. It's about making sure this never happens again." He was joined at the podium by Colonel Mitchell, Senator Coleman, and General Williams, all of whom had traveled to Richmond to show their support. The Veterans Legal Defense Initiative, Dylan announced, will provide legal assistance to any veteran who faces persecution by corrupt law enforcement. We will ensure that no military family has to fight alone against institutional corruption. Colonel Mitchell stepped forward to add context to the announcement. The United States Army, in partnership with veterans organizations and civil rights groups, is funding this initiative to honor Staff Sergeant Parker's courage and to protect all veterans from the kind of injustice he faced. Senator Coleman addressed the policy implications of Dylan's case. Congress is passing the Military Veterans Protection Act, which will provide federal oversight of any criminal case involving a veteran defendant. Local prosecutors will no longer be able to railroad military families without federal review. The press conference concluded with Dylan taking questions from journalists who had followed his case from the beginning. "Staff Sergeant Parker," one reporter asked, "how has this experience changed you?" Dylan considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, I thought my military service was behind me, that I had done my part for democracy and could live quietly as a civilian. I learned that the fight for justice never ends, that defending the Constitution is a lifelong commitment, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought in courtrooms rather than on foreign battlefields. Another reporter asked, "What would you say to other veterans who might face similar situations?" "Fight back. Trust in the system when the system is working correctly. But don't hesitate to escalate to federal authorities when local systems are corrupted. And remember that you have brothers and sisters in arms who will stand with you, no matter what." 3 months later, Dylan stood in his new Pentagon office, reviewing case files from veterans across the country, seeking assistance from the Veterans Legal Defense Initiative. The program had received over 500 requests in its first 90 days. Captain Rodriguez entered with the morning briefing. "Staff Sergeant, 12 new cases this week. All involve veterans targeted by local police." Dylan reviewed the files, seeing familiar patterns. "What's the status of Sean Mitchell's co-conspirators?" "All 17 sentenced to federal prison, 8 to 15 years each. The police department is under federal oversight with a complete restructuring mandate." Captain Rodriguez handed him a letter. This came from Marcus Williams, the man whose son was framed by Mitchell. Dylan read Marcus's words. "Staff Sergeant Parker, my son has been accepted to Virginia Tech with a full scholarship. The university reviewed his case after Mitchell's conviction and chose his high school record over false charges. He starts engineering school in the fall. You didn't just save your own life, you saved my son's future. Thank you for showing us that justice is possible." Dylan set the letter down, thinking about Sean Mitchell serving his 25-year sentence in federal prison. The challenge coin on his desk caught the light. Da Presso Liber had become his life mission. His mother called, as she did daily. "Dylan, I saw your news interview this morning. The program is growing fast, Mom. Apparently there are many more Sean Mitchells out there. And you're going to stop them all? One case at a time, one family at a time. Your father would be proud." That evening, Dylan sat on his Arlington apartment balcony, watching the sunset. His phone buzzed. "Staff Sergeant Parker, I'm Jennifer Martinez, a Marine veteran, arrested in Arizona. They claimed I was resisting, but I think they targeted me for my military service. Can you help?" Dylan replied immediately, "Yes, we can help. Call our hotline tomorrow. You're not alone." As he sent the message, Dylan reflected on his transformation from private citizen to national advocate. Sean Mitchell had tried to silence him with 3 bullets. Instead, he had given Dylan a platform for justice. The challenge coin sat on his coffee table. De oppresso liber, no longer just military motto, but Dylan's mission. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, Sean Mitchell was serving his sentence, thinking about the night he decided to execute a veteran and how it destroyed everything he'd built. But Dylan wasn't thinking about Sean anymore. He was thinking about Jennifer Martinez, about the cases on his desk, about corrupt officers still terrorizing military families. Dylan had learned that justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. Sometimes the most important battles weren't fought overseas, but in American courtrooms. Sean Mitchell had tried to end Dylan's story with bullets. Instead, he had given Dylan Parker a new beginning. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't see your true worth? Have you ever witnessed injustice that seemed protected by systems designed to avoid accountability? If this story resonated with you, share it. Don't let the lessons of prejudice and accountability be forgotten in the noise of daily life. If you're moved by stories that spark change and call for justice, hit subscribe. We've got plenty more powerful tales of truth and transformation coming your way, because sometimes it takes one person's courage to lift up an entire system of justice. Thank you for following this story to its conclusion. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps ensure that stories of accountability continue to be told when they matter most.